So in one of my videos a while back, I basically made a video about how mushrooms ended up helping my OCD symptoms and how I was using that to end up treating it. And while I definitely had a lot of benefits from that, a big part of why I've been OCD free pretty much is just from pretty much understanding the dynamics behind it and what exactly is going wrong in the brain and what activities you should and shouldn't engage in. And for me, I had to figure this out for, it took me a while actually to figure it out. It was through experience that I learned what is good thoughts and what isn't good thoughts. And when I was 12, I was doing cognitive behavioral therapy for it, but they couldn't really get any sort of ideas across because I was so young. I couldn't really comprehend what exactly they were trying to explain to me, and I don't even think they were doing it right. But how I was able to stop it from happening, and I should also mention that it's not completely gone in terms of it has no effect on my life. I may not have illogical, intrusive thoughts that are constantly bothering me, but certain instances, for example, if I were to message someone on Facebook that's my friend or whatever, and they don't get back to me, or the message doesn't go through, immediately my brain will say, oh, they don't like me, or oh, they blocked me, or whatever. Even though it's not true, my brain immediately tries to tell me the worst case scenario, and that is a bit of an issue that I've been working through now, but that's a bit of a bleed over with OCD. But I'm going to get into the main symptoms that I had when I was younger and what I still deal with. And basically, I have like pure O, which is mostly intrusive thoughts. And I also had a bit of a checking compulsion too. There was one instance where I was playing a video game, Diablo 2 expansion, and we had an inventory with all your items, so I would constantly keep checking my inventory to make sure everything was there and I didn't accidentally drop something. It was illogical, but I kept doing it over and over and over and feeding that compulsion. And then there was also another instance where I had this weird OCD thought that I wasn't in my body anymore, I was someone else, so I had to keep checking the mirror to make sure that I was there. And myself and not someone else. So I definitely had very, very bizarre OCD symptoms. But a lot of the times with me, it was mostly intrusive thoughts. So it would try to tell me something about myself that isn't true, but that would give me anxiety. And a lot of the times these things would be very powerful, and they would be very, very based on my identity as a person. And I didn't want to have that to be true. I wanted to be who I was and not what my intrusive thoughts were trying to tell me that I was. And I would also have the OCD thought of fearing that I was gonna just randomly harm someone, and that's something that I end up getting here every now and again. I would just be sitting talking with someone, and then I'd be thinking, there's always a thought that it's the what if thought basically that goes rampant in the OCD mind. And I always say, what if I were just to all of a sudden start being violent and hitting this person that I'm talking to, and then that would give me anxiety. And when I was younger, that I would get that too, and I would end up feeding the compulsion by hiding certain objects and anything that could be used as a weapon, like knives or anything. I would end up trying to hide those and try to avoid those. And that's actually the opposite of what you're supposed to do. They always do something called exposure therapy, where you're supposed to expose yourself to the thing that gives you anxiety. But for me, how I was able to get over my OCD symptoms is anytime I get a thought, a what if thought, usually when it's trying to tell you something that you don't believe is true about yourself, that either you're violent or it could be about your sexuality. Some people have the fear of you know, what if I'm gay or something, and that was something that actually I dealt with back when I was 12, and that one caused me a lot of anxiety. So basically, instead of when I had that one, I would basically keep trying to give myself reasons of why it's not true, and I would keep trying to engage with those kinds of thoughts, and that's not, it would be a thought of saying that's not true because this and this, and I would constantly brainstorm the reasons why that's not true. But even though that caused temporary relief, it would end up just digging a hole deeper, and then I would be more stuck in this constant cycle. And it would get worse and worse and worse the more that I engaged with the compulsion of trying to prove the intrusive thought incorrect. So that's actually what OCD is trying to make you do. It's trying to make you engage with these thoughts. It's trying to make you, it gives you anxiety, and then it wants to make you try to analyze it and try to figure it out why it's not true. And trying to prove that it's not. And then when you keep doing that, it just spirals out of control. It did for me. And it just it basically overwhelmed my whole consciousness to the point where that's all I could focus on. And I was just in a constant state of extreme anxiety and had no ability to let go of it. And what's happening is that anytime you're performing a compulsion, or you're feeding the habit or doing the ritual to give you temporary relief, what ends up happening is your brain actually creates a stronger connection. Anytime you perform the compulsion, it's like a habit, and there's actually proteins that solidify in the connections that you're making, so it makes it harder to break that. So eventually I found out what you're supposed to do, and it's this is the main thing that you're supposed to do, but it's extremely difficult for OCD sufferers because it's completely against the grain and completely against what it feels like you're supposed to do. You feel like you're supposed to engage this thing and try to figure out a way to overcome it in a logical way by saying, oh, that's not true because of this specific reason, and then I can feel comfortable with that reason of why this isn't true. And that just doesn't work. It ends up saying, oh, but it might be true because blah 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 blah, and you end up just keep going through this cycle, and then it's a constant cycle of and it just gets worse and worse and worse. So what you're supposed to do is you're actually supposed to break that loop. You're supposed to break that cycle. And I know it's very difficult, and this requires training. It took me a long time to really get the hang of how to do this. But basically how normal brains work is that when they get an intrusive thought that causes them anxiety and it causes them distress, they might get a bit of a distress from the thought from the beginning, but then they'll basically let the thought pass from their mind, and then they'll focus on something else, and something else will catch their attention. But with OCD, you're really fixated on specific thoughts, and if something gives you an anxiety, there's this obsessive need to really solve it before you move on to something else. And so you have to basically teach your brain to move on without solving the equation in this weird loop way that you've discovered is the only way to do it in your head. So when I get a thought of what if I'm going to hurt this person that I'm talking to, I just say, okay, yeah, that gives me anxiety, but I'm just going to focus on something else and try to get my brain to think about something else instead of giving that thought any energy. And if it's for things like sexuality, you say, okay, I'm okay with that thought of you know, I'm gay, who cares, you know? You have to, there's a level of acceptance that you need to do. There's this letting go process that needs to happen. And for me, I was able to learn that more with the use of mushrooms to treat it, because there's a process of letting go, and there's a point where you give up control, and you're just like, you know what, I don't want to be in control of this. And that's the main problem, is OCD people need to be in control all the time of all of these thoughts, and you need to be able to train your brain to just let go of control and just let it be and let it pass. Instead of trying to grab onto it and hold onto it, you just let it go through your brain. The thought goes through your brain, and then it exits out while you basically preoccupy your mind with something else. You know, you need to be able to learn how to just move on from the thought instead of holding on to it. And this definitely sounds easy, but for OCD sufferers, this is the big problem with them, is that they have trouble doing this. So if you can at least focus on what your mind is supposed to do and how you're not supposed to feed the compulsions, and make it more of a habit to basically try to outsmart the thoughts with logic. You're supposed to just let it go and not engage with it. The less you engage with the thought, the better off you'll be, because there won't be any compulsive habit to try to engage with it and give it energy. And then because the more energy you give it, the more it has you. So that's the dynamic that you're supposed to understand with OCD. And it takes a lot of practice. It's not going to come right away, but eventually I began to understand that dynamic, and I began to try to implement it as best I could. When I was a beginner with OCD, I didn't understand this dynamic, so I would just constantly do the wrong things and feed my compulsions without knowing how much worse that was making me. So I think that just understanding this is a big step in trying to figure out how to overcome OCD. Because if you understand, if you look at it as a circuit board and it's creating a loop error, you basically have to debug it and try to fix it. And this is basically the debugging software, and you just have to implement it and trust that it works. Other than that, there's really no other thing to do. If you're trying to beat it with feeding the compulsions, it's not going to get you anywhere. So as long as people understand this process, I think that they would be much better off in trying to overcome it. So that's pretty much my opinion on OCD. You guys are feel free to add your thoughts and your experiences with it, and if this has helped. And yeah, I'd definitely be interested in hearing about that. So I will see you guys in the next video.